Okay, hi everyone. This is a live Zoom class, and today we're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day and what did Columbus discover. And we're going to do this by talking about his voyages and contact, and why maybe we should be having and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day and not Columbus Day. So I'm going to do this by moving through the PowerPoint, and I'll go through the PowerPoint, and then later we can stop for questions. People that are watching this can do homework questions over it if they want to, or do any kind of take notes over it and save their questions for later. Okay, so in our classes, we've talked about this migration across the world. And this migration started in Africa somewhere around 150,000 years ago. It doesn't really matter in the archaeology or in the science or in the DNA if it was 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago. You're going to see a lot of different kinds of dates on this information. But the archaeology around the world, the point of it is that it matches the DNA and this migration story that they left Africa around 150,000 years ago. They move up into Central Asia and then into Western Asia, down to Australia by 50,000 years ago. All of this matches, and then into the islands by 30,000 years ago in South Pacific. And that they crossed into North America somewhere around 18,000 to 15,000 years ago. It doesn't really matter if it was 25,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago. They could have moved somewhere in that time frame. When the ice bridge was in Beringia, they were able to cross into the Western Hemisphere and then down into North America. And remember, these people are walking, they're not riding horses. They could be coming in canoes down the west coast of the United States, where the United States is now, and down into South America. So the question is, how long does it take you to walk from Alaska to Argentina? Really? So you guys have gone through this information in the beginning of your course on your own, looking at migration articles and watching stories about DNA and human migration. And this is the best science that we have right now. And how we know that is, so far, there's nothing in the Western Hemisphere that's older than 18,000 years old. So today, we're going to be looking at this migration that came down through Central America into South America. And the latest DNA, really as of a month ago, they've been checking and redoing the DNA of the islanders in the Caribbean. And they're all from South America. All of their DNA can be traced from South America. So it's logical that they came down through Central America into South America and then worked their way up to going island to island up into the Antilles. And the very last place they would have stopped is Cuba. That's the curious thing about this migration. the very end of this long migration from Africa ends in Cuba. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is Cuba. And Cuba, before Columbus, pre-colonial, pre-Columbian times now, in anthropology, we call it pre-colonial. We don't even call it prehistoric times anymore because they had a history. These indigenous ancient people had history. So we'll call it pre-colonial in the New World. So in pre-colonial times, there were two groups of indigenous people. There were the Taino people that are these lines moving across in the eastern part of Cuba, and the Siboney that are in the western part of Cuba. And they're speaking different languages. There's about 350,000 people in Cuba when Columbus lands there. And we'll get to that pretty soon. In this area of the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas, and Cuba, the Taino distribution circa before Columbus was about 2 million people. So imagine that, 2 million Taino, Arawak, and people living in these islands, all descended from South America. And this is kind of broken up into classic groups of where they came from and how they migrated. And as I mentioned, very recent studies show that these indigenous people came from South America, from Venezuela and Brazil primarily. And you're going to see here this Western group, the Guanahatabebes, in the Western group here of Cuba, is speaking even a different languages that is not Taino. And we still don't know that much about Western Cuba. They may have been coming from Mexico even. It hasn't really been proven. But so far, there hasn't been any proof that the people in Cuba, even though 90 miles away, came from Florida. And there's no proof that the Guanahatabebes, there's not a B, extra B in there, came from Mexico, even though it's probably a couple hundred miles away. Okay, so Columbus lands on Cuba. And they have interpreters. He lands on Cuba on October 27th, 1492. So the first place he lands is in Salvador, in the Bahamas. The very second place he lands is in Cuba, which we'll get to at the end of this lecture. On October 27th, 1492. And he lands down here in the lower right-hand corner in these provinces down on the lower right-hand side. But when he gets there, there are already 29 what we would call chiefdoms or tribes in Cuba, and about already 350,000 people living in Cuba. So this is why people say Columbus didn't discover America or the New World. There were already people here. And it's true. There were millions of people here before Columbus got here. So he's the first European to discover the New World, the Western Hemisphere, but not the first person. So 29 different chiefdoms here. And they're speaking Taino. And again, this language can be traced back to South America through the Arawak Indians and the Caribs, C-A-R-I-B, Carib Indians of the Caribbean. Now, why is this important to know? So the Spanish were meticulous about recording things. They were meticulous about recording everything they saw. So this is a Spanish drawing in the early 16th century of somebody lying in a hammock. It's the first time that the Spanish would have witnessed this, seeing this. And it's, of course, it's an important thing today about going to the islands. The first thing you do is set up your hammock between a couple of trees and figure out what you're going to be, where you're going to be sitting all week, looking at the ocean while you're having your vacation. So hammock is a Caribbean word. Barbecue. Barbecue is the first time the Spanish saw anyone barbecuing, cooking fish over some kind of grill like this outdoor, was when they witnessed the Taino Indians, indigenous people doing this and barbecuing. So a lot of words come from the Taino that we use, including canoe, including hammock, including hurricane. So we think about the words we use all the time, and barbecue, barbacoa. Barbacoa is a Taino word, an Arawakan-based word from South America. And so this is why it's important to understand the link to the indigenous peoples, to their language, and how the Spanish are going to later use these words to modify them into their own language, including papaya and potato, savanna, tobacco. It's the first time in yucca, which is like a root crop. It's the first time the Spanish see all these things. So the Spanish are entering into this. These are the karst limestone mountains called Magotes in Western Cuba. And the oldest civilization, like anywhere in archaeology, are people that live in caves. And so the oldest archaeology in Cuba is in caves. And so that's where archaeologists in the early 20th century begin to look for the oldest inhabitants on Cuba. And they're going to find things like pottery. They're going to find things like shell middens and shell tools we're going to see. And they also find petroglyphs, similar painted, in this case, they're pictographs. They're painted using plant oils. They're going to paint pictographs. And a lot of times they're depicting maybe stars or concentric circles. Some of the circles are pretty large. These are going to date back to anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. So about 1,000 BC, some of these go back to. And remember, just like any other indigenous group, they're worshiping nature. And these indigenous people are pretty much living in a paradise in Cuba. There's 350,000 of them, but they're surrounded by the ocean and bountiful sea life and fish that they're living off of and that they're eating. And also a lot of tropical fruits we're going to see. So this is what you would call a Stone Age culture. They are using some stone tools, but mostly they're using shells to create their tools. And there is some similarities with other petroglyphs in different places where even carved out rock are showing ideas about spiritualism and about connectivity with their worldview and their natural world. Even there's something that looks like in the southwest of New Mexico, we would call a cocopelli. This cocopelli, this figure that looks like he's playing a flute, or what we might call a flute player, is actually inhaling an hallucinogen. This is a shaman of the Taino inhaling hallucinogens, and that's how it was determined that the people knew their shamans and their leadership were communicating with their gods. So again, the Spanish are recording everything they see. So the drawings that they're doing in the early 1500s, the early 16th century, we could say that these are going to be pretty accurate, that they're wearing feathers and shell beads, and they're observing ceremonies and traditions that the indigenous Taino are practicing. And they're going through all of these traditions while the Spanish are observing them. This is a unique situation. What was pre-colonial now is becoming historic. They're recording the historic period of the Taino indigenous people on Cuba for the first time as an outsider observing them. And so we know about the kind of clothing they wore. We also know what kind of houses they lived in. These are called bohíos, B-O-H-I-O-S. And the octagonal ones, or the six-sided ones, were more for the common people. They were what you would call a roundhouse. The square ones, because of the archaeology they found inside doing excavation, were for the elites or for the chiefs of the group to live in. These bohíos, we know they're there, they're gone now, of course, but the post holes are still there. So we know how the post holes are set up by doing archaeology in Cuba. We can find out what kind of houses they lived in. And they looked something like this. They would have been using perishable materials and palm leaves to cover the roofs. The roofs probably would have lasted 6 or 8 years, and then they would have to redo them and replenish them. And they're living in communal houses. Again, you might have 6 or 8 families in one of these big houses. And the houses get really big. So there is a reconstructed Taino village in Cuba that you can visit as tourists, and you can see how big these houses were. There's safety in numbers, of course, but also you could have a lot of people living inside. And it's a subtropical area. They're gonna get anywhere between 50 and 60 inches of rain a year. So they need a dry space. They need some place inside where they can go during the rainy season. So as I was mentioning, the Taino people and all the people of the Caribbean before the Spanish get there are living in paradise. There's plenty of food. There's an amazingly abundant sea life that they can use for a food source. They're collecting fruits that are naturally growing there. And they're also growing cassava, which is a root crop that's originated here. And so they have plenty of food sources. And this is a Spanish drawing of how the indigenous people here in the Caribbean are using nets to catch fish. This is the early 1500s. These are things that the Spanish are observing. And this is a hook made from a bone. The Taino Arawak people in the Caribbean have no metal whatsoever. They did not, make gold or silver objects. They didn't have any kind of metallurgy. This is a fish hook made from a bone that even the Hawaiians and some of the South Pacific groups are making this kind of fish hook, which works perfectly fine from bone. And so animals they would have encountered in the shallow area around the island in their canoes would have been things like sharks. They may have not killed sharks regularly for food, but they surely ran into them. And here is a remora or a shark sucker, and they probably ran into them too. They're harmless. If you ever scuba dived or if you ever do go scuba diving, one might try and chase you because you're bigger than it is and attach itself to you, but they're pretty harmless overall. So these indigenous people, the Taino, these groups spend a lot of times around the rivers and at the ocean side. And they didn't build any monumental architecture. These people are not building pyramids. They're not building monumental cities. They're building temporary fishing camps. Why? Because you can have a group of people fishing in a certain area on a river or by the ocean, and after a while it gets fished out and they want to move their camp. So they're really living in temporary camps that they can move quickly if they want to. So they build shelter, they build fires, they build their canoes, they're building their spears, which are also bone spear points that they're using to catch fish in the shallow water here. And as I mentioned, there's plenty of food source. So they're really living in paradise. The wooden canoes sadly don't still exist. They've never found one in Cuba. They have found some older ones and they know what trees they're made out of. It's a tree called a cotton tree in Cuba where they could, a large tree that they can carve out and make a canoe of. And again, we know this because the Spanish record it and they make drawings of the Taino using their canoes. And there is also, they found one of these canoes, a pre-colonial canoe in Florida in the swamp. Wooden artifacts will not survive in the open air. If they're submerged in water, they will survive. So axe handles, canoes, anything made out of wood, if it's in water, it will survive for a certain amount of time. Other drawings and paintings come out of these early voyages of the Spanish, where they're observing the Taino people living in their villages. This is what cassava looks like. The Spanish are going to take cassava, which is like a, it's kind of a root crop like a yucca or a potato type carbohydrate type root crop. And they're going to take this to Africa. And cassava becomes one of the main crops in Africa later on. And it came from Cuba. It came from the Spanish bringing cassava to Africa. And you can take this cassava and you can pound it out. Now, they don't really have very much corn and they don't make tortillas. You can go to Cuba today and you're not going to find a tortilla. But they made this kind of cracker bread from the cassava. And again, the Spanish are seeing them do this and they're witnessing them using this for a food source. Pineapple. When the Spanish get to Cuba, they see pineapple for the first time. Pineapple, turns out, comes from Brazil. The DNA of these pineapple in Cuba are from Brazil. So another more evidence that the indigenous people migrated from South America and brought these pineapples with them. There's two different species of pineapple in Brazil, turns out. And these, when they were tested in Cuba, they came from South America. Corn. The corn that exists in Cuba came from South America as well. They've checked the DNA of it. Corn originated in the Valley of Mexico about 9,000 years ago, somewhere around there. And the species, different species of corn, spread through Central America into South America, and then up through the islands to Cuba. So far, there hasn't been any corn found in Cuba that came directly from Mexico. And this is Ernest Hemingway feeding corn to his cat in the 50s, in the late 50s, I would say, just in case you were wondering where the corn came from. And turtles. Turtles are pretty easy to catch. The sea turtles, the loggerhead, green, and hawksbill sea turtles. And the meat is very delicious. It tastes like roast beef if you've never eaten turtle. It's against the law now because turtles are protected. But imagine in pre-colonial times how many turtles there were around the island. And they could use their shells for tools. And they did the same thing with these guys, with the manatees that would have been swimming around Cuba. Not really sure how much they used manatees for a food source, but they did use their bones to make tools and to make ritual bone artifacts. This is one made from a manatee bone, as a matter of fact. It's called a spatula of made from manatee bone. That's in the museum there in Havana. And this is a large rodent, descendant of a capybara. They eat these as well. These are kind of large animals. They're like small dogs or very big cats. And you'll see these capybaras in cages on people's farms still today. Again, tastes kind of like roast beef, pretty tasty. So this is an indigenous mammal to Cuba that the Taino would have been able to use for a food source. And then things like seafood and conch and shells, of course, were all around the island. And they made other objects. A lot of these are ritual objects. A lot of them related to their rain gods and their spirits that were recovered mostly from caves, artifacts. And here is guanabo. They call it guava or guayabana or guayaba. So there's three different things they call this fruit, but it's an indigenous fruit to Cuba. So they would have had access to this fruit. And tobacco. The first time the Spanish see someone smoking tobacco is gonna be on Cuba. And they're not only smoking tobacco, they're kind of worshiping tobacco. This is a tobacco god. This is about actually 1 meter high, 3 feet high, a wooden tobacco idol that's in the museum in Havana now. But they worship tobacco and they smoke tobacco, and smoking, they thought it was a healthy thing. They thought it was something that cured illnesses and was good for them. So there's also low leaf carvings on the limestone that's observed by the Taino. In a way, these low leaf carvings, they don't have any hieroglyphs, or they don't have any really way to read or understand, what these carvings might mean. But a lot of times they just did paintings or more pictographs of the carvings. And they're usually front facing. these individuals on these panels, on these stones. And a lot of times they're set up in a ring around which they played a game called Batai, B-A-T-A-Y, Batai. And it looks similar, very similar to the ball game that the Mayans are going to play in Central America. And it's thought that the chieftains would enjoy these games. This is an actual Batay court on Cuba that's original in its location. And it's thought that the chiefs may bet against each other in the game, that they probably used a rubber ball in the middle of the game and maybe tried to hit that rock to score. It's hard to say how the game was played, even though the Spanish probably would have observed it. These are yokes that the ball players probably would have worn to make contact with this ball, similar to the way the Mayans wore hachas around their waist and around their arms to make contact with the ball. And shells that they would have collected, drilled holes in to make beads or ornaments. And here's some shells that were intentionally carved up and utilized as tools. And here's some of the beads. These would have been seashells that they could have easily gathered from the shallow reef. Some of these individuals look kind of scary or spiritual, probably have something to do again with rain and the crops. Remember, these people are growing crops, they're agriculturalists. The earliest recorded Taino are about 3,000 years ago. So 3,000 BC, so 5,000 years ago are the earliest Taino recording on the island. And some of these objects are going to go back 3,000 or 4,000 years. Just another figure stone that was recovered again from a cave. And then there's a curious object called three-pointers that they find all over in the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And they find these a lot of times buried in their fields. And they think that they are offerings to the gods to help their crops grow. They look a little bit like potatoes or cassavas. And so that's the best that the archaeologists have been able to come up with. And they do find them in the fields, buried quite often when they're doing excavation. And they come in various shapes and sizes. What you can see here, and the point I'm trying to get across, is this is a very complex society that Columbus discovered. It had been there for thousands of years, developing their traditions, their rituals, their behaviors, their social relationships, and creating these complex chiefdoms that he found, the 29 chiefdoms of Cuba when he landed there. Here's another one that looks maybe even a little bit more like a potato or cassava. And they usually have strange faces, spiritual, probably connections. Here's one that's interesting. There's no snakes on Cuba. There's like no poisonous snakes, I should say. There's 6 smaller snakes, none of which, I've seen one, none of which are poisonous. But this looks more like a python or something. And then they made other objects out of ceramic, ancestors. Here is an example of a shaman snorting this cohiba seed that's going to make him hallucinate over a period of time, and then he would have visions and tell the people in the group of his group about these visions, about him communicating with the god. And before they would do these inhalations of these hallucinogenic seeds, they would fast for 3 days before they would do that. More ceramic bowls. Ceramics are about 1,200 years old. The oldest ceramics on Cuba are from about 800 AD. So, and they made all different shapes and sizes. In this case, this vessel was tested for cohiba residue and it tested positive. So this might be a vessel where they were holding the sacred cohiba seed that they would use in these hallucinogenic ceremonies. This is a frog that's probably a greenstone, type greenstone. Frogs are symbols of humidity and rain, so it would have been a good luck object to have. And wooden chairs are carved out of local trees there. And they would have been had to have been in caves as well and to dry circumstances to survive. And this is actually a snifter. This is made out of stone, and it has a hole going through the middle of it where it could be used for inhaling the cohiba seed. And this is a spatula, what they call a spatula with a bat on it. And this bat is a symbol of the underworld, just like for the Maya. The Taino believed that the bats were their ancestors. And when they came out of the caves at night, thousands and thousands of them, they were coming out of the underworld and traveling through the night. So things like bats were revered as sacred. So getting back to the ceremony, the shamans would fast for 3 days. Then they would use the spatula to gag themselves and then vomit, aspirate for a while. And then they would sniff these cohiba seeds. This would make the seeds more active and more hallucinogenic to have a greater effect. Now, how do we know all that? The Spanish are observing these traditions, these rituals. And this is thought to be a ceramic, but it's an owl face. So the owl, the tecolote in Spanish, is a revered, again, kind of creature of the night, a creature who has power over the night and the darkness, and also for wisdom. And this was actually found in the Dominican Republic. It's a doll made out of fabric and yucca fabric, but it's also thought to be the Earth Mother. The Tainos had a story, a creation story of the Earth Mother that bore the first children that became the founding fathers and mothers of the entire civilization. Okay, so we know Columbus didn't discover the New World. There were 350,000 people living on Cuba when he got there. Turns out that this week, 2 weeks ago, they have pinpointed the dates that the Vikings got to Newfoundland, which was about 1021 AD, it turns out. So exactly this year, 1,000 years ago, they were in North America. So Columbus shows up with his ships and their clothing and their flags. And the Taino thought, oh, these people are here to help us. They're here to, we've been waiting for them and now they're here. And they with their metal swords and their shields and their armor and their ships, it's going to be a good thing that the Spanish are here. This is Baracoa on the southeast coast. where actually it would be like the northeast coast, where Columbus landed. And this is a marking there in Baracoa of where the best guess they have of where Columbus landed. Again, October 27th, 1492. Beautiful little place, about 5,000 people still living there. That's what it looks like today even. Small little town. It's a long drive from anywhere to get there, but there's lots of little towns like this around the shores of Cuba still. And so the trip from Cuba, he came again from this top marking here, this purple line was the first trip, 1492 and 93. He stopped in San Salvador, lands in Cuba. He calls Cuba Juana. He names the island Juana and goes on to Hispaniola and discovers that too. He actually ends up discovering and planting flags on 29 different little islands, Spanish flags, to claim these territories for Spain. And of course, he's looking for gold and silver and anything of value. He's not finding any of these things. So he goes back, that purple line at the top. He comes back on the second voyage, which is the green line. He comes down, hits the south coast of Cuba, follows that line along up to a place called Isla de Juventud. And he realizes that these people are speaking a different language. He runs into the Siboney people of Western Cuba. And he turns around and comes back, winds his way through the islands and returns to Spain. The third trip, he ends up skirting Hispaniola and going to South America, down by Venezuela, and goes back to Spain. The fourth trip, he comes through south of Hispaniola, the red line, north of Jamaica, and then across over to Honduras and Nicaragua. Doesn't find any passage he's really looking for. He thinks he's in the Indies. He thinks he's in India the whole time. And goes back to Spain. So the 4 voyages of Columbus. This is a cross in a church called Isla de la Parra, Iglesia de la Parra, sorry, in Baracoa. That dates to, they dated this wood actually to about 1515. So it may not be the exact cross that Columbus claimed Cuba with, but it came from that time period. This is the church that the cross is inside still, 1515. That's an old one for the New World. So what happens with Columbus and his encounters with the indigenous people? Hauti is a Taino chieftain who is on the Dominican Republic. He is a Taino warrior. And he decides, and he's also on the Cuban beer can, Hauti, and he's also the symbol of the silhouette of the Cohiba cigars in Cuba. So he is revered kind of as a hero. He comes in 1508 to tell the Taino people of Cuba that the Spanish are not there to help them, that they're there to possess them and enslave them and take their women and children, and that they should fight back. So about this time, 1506, Columbus dies. And it's sad, he dies never knowing Cuba's an island. He had been on the northeast coast, he had skirted the south coast, but he never circumnavigated it. And so he dies 1506, back in Spain, never knowing Cuba was an island. I find that kind of ironic, seeing as he thought he was in India the whole time. And so he sends his son to Salvador, Columbus, to Cuba to be the governor, to take over the exploration. He and Diego Velazquez are sent by the Spanish government to squash any kind of indigenous rebellion that may occur in Cuba. This is Diego Velazquez's house in Cuba. It's in Santiago de Cuba, the city of. It is the oldest house in the New World, European house. So it would have been somewhere, they've dated the wood around to 1510. Inside the house, beautiful fans. Remember, there's no iron. These fan lights are carved out of wood with the stained glass inlaid. And there's also a big courtyard for gathering rainwater and cisterns for drinking water. And there's even a smelter in here in case they did find any gold or silver. They would be able to process the gold and silver in this house. So when Hauti comes, he says in Taino to his people, "Here is the God the Spaniards worship, for they fight and they persecute us, and this is why we have to throw them into the sea. They tell us, these tyrants, that they adore a God of peace and equality, and yet they usurp our land and make us their slaves. They speak to us of an immortal soul and of their eternal rewards and punishments, and yet they rob our belongings, seduce our women, violate our daughters. Incapable of matching us in valor, these cowards cover themselves with iron that our weapons cannot break." So he comes again in 1508, Hauti, to tell the Taino they need to fight against the Spanish. So right away, within 16 years, the indigenous people are fighting against the Spanish. But the Spanish are strong. They have dogs, they have weapons, they have guns, they have swords, and they basically decimate the European, the indigenous population of Cuba. Now, it's not only the labor and the torture, it's also smallpox. So 1492, Columbus gets to Cuba, 350,000 people. By 1520, there's only 30,000 left out of the 2 million indigenous people in Cuba. By 1565, that would be 73 years, the Taino are considered to be extinct. Every last one of the Taino are dead. And Hauti fights against Diego Velazquez's army. And in 1511, they catch up with them. And Diego Velazquez tells Hauti, "You can die like honorable, and we'll cut your head off, and you'll go to heaven with the Spanish soldiers. Or if you decide not to, we'll burn you at the stake like a savage, like a heathen, like an unbeliever." Remember, these people are Catholics too, and they're thinking that anyone who isn't Catholic in the New World is a heathen. So anyway, Hauti says, "Where did you say the Spanish people are?" And they said, "In heaven. We'll cut your head off." And he said, I'd rather go to the other place, burn me at the stake." So that's what they did in 1511. They put down this insurrection. So long story short, they've been doing DNA studies of the people in the Caribbean. And they found recently that some of the people in Puerto Rico and isolated areas have up to 61% Taino blood there. And on Cuba, it's as high as 30 to 35% DNA of the Taino. So they're not exactly extinct. They continued, of course, to live and interact with other people, and the Tainos went through the whole process and survived to a certain point. And they've begun to revive these ceremonies and rituals in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and in Jamaica even, in some cases, where the Arawak and the Taino would have lived. These people, when you look at the Cubans, you can tell they're a wide mix of different people from all over the world. They can be African, they can be Chinese, they can be Black, they can be white, they can be Spanish, they can be, and they are all of that. But turns out quite a few of them are Taino. So the Tainos were always afraid of boats after then, of course, because the boats meant that the foreigners were coming. And the ships that Columbus came in all ended up sinking. One of them in Jamaica, and the Santa Maria sunk somewhere off of the Dominican Republic. But it kind of meant danger to the Cubans. So the Cubans now, for a lot of other reasons, are trying to get off of Cuba. And they'll take their boats and go across any way they can to get away from their, now COVID's caused a lot of economic problems there. And here's, like, I think a 59 Oldsmobile, could be a Pontiac, sailing across with the Coast Guard chasing it. So anyways, the long story short was that the indigenous people were happy. They were surviving. They had plenty of food. They had relationships with their other chieftains on their island. There were 350,000 people living on Cuba when the Spanish got there. And they were decimated mostly by smallpox and disease, which is going to happen later on in Mexico and South America, we know. But it's interesting to imagine if the Spanish had not come, Spanish, Portuguese, and the English, right, to the New World, and how these indigenous groups would have developed through the centuries. Okay. Oh, so that's the end of that story. Why it would be more important to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. And do you have any questions?
I think I'm good. I really enjoyed that story. It was very good.
Yeah. Okay. Good deal. All right. That will be great. So we will see you next time for a live Zoom. This will be posted in class, and you can watch it and you can take it, use it for generating homework questions if you want to. Yeah, and we'll move on to the next story. So take care. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Phil.
See ya.